All right, Republican Senator Marco Rubio is on a solidarity visit in Israel, meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier today. Kalev Ben-David sat down with the senator in an exclusive interview to discuss security threats faced by both the U.S. and Israel. Take a look.
Senator Marco Rubio, thank you for coming to Israel, and thank you for joining us on I-24 News.
I'm happy to be here in person in your studios, and I appreciate the chance to do this.
Well, thank you for coming. Now, you're speaking to us after meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So first of all, what was your message to him, and what was his message to you?
Well, I think his message to me is the one you've seen publicly, which is this commitment to finish the operation in Gaza, in particular with regards to Rafah. And one of the things that drove me to visit here is I don't think enough attention is being paid in the United States to what's happening in the north of Israel, where tens of thousands of Israelis have been displaced from their homes, where kids have had to leave school because of a situation there with Hezbollah, which has, of course, increased since what happened on October 7th. And so even as the situation in Gaza continues to unfold and the Israelis are going to do what they need to do in order to make sure that Hamas is no longer a threat, we have this looming situation in the north of Israel with Hezbollah that's going to have to be addressed as well.
Well, let me ask you, you're vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. You have access to the privy to the most sensitive intelligence information about Iran and its proxies like Hezbollah. There's been mixed signals from the administration about whether Israel would have the green light to deal with Hezbollah, and maybe eventually Iran itself. I want to get your feelings on that.
Well, I can't speak for the administration. Hezbollah is multiple times more capable militarily than Hamas. It has not just an arsenal of rockets, but of guided munitions. They can produce it domestically. And basically every single day there are alerts and launches against the north of Israel. So Hezbollah is a pre-existing threat that I think has now only grown. What happened on October 7th with Gaza can never happen again, much less in the north. And it's a situation Israel's going to have to confront. And I know that they know this. Now, ideally, the situation would be that there'd be some agreement of some sort that creates a demilitarized or buffer zone within the south of Lebanon. That's the ideal outcome, obviously. But I think there needs to be greater awareness in the United States about how serious the situation is.
Well, what should be the U.S. role? Because the U.S. has been in active combat with other Iranian proxies in Iraq, for example, in Syria, the Houthis in the Red Sea.
Well, I think part of this is Hezbollah's willingness to agree to some return of some sort of demilitarized zone where they wouldn't have ground troops there and the ability to immediately invade the north of Israel will be in very many ways driven by what their perceptions are of international support. I mean, for Israel. And if they believe that Israel's exhausted all of its international goodwill, and in particular support from the United States because of Gaza, they may very well feel like there's no pressure on them and that they have all the leverage to continue doing what they're doing and to make no adjustments in Lebanon. So I think that's why it's important. I would tell you that in the United States, the number of Americans who are aware of the number of people from northern Israel who have been permanently displaced or have been displaced is nil. Most people are not even aware that this is a reality. And I say, you know, if 60 or 70 or 80 or 90,000 people in Texas were permanently displaced from Texas because some cartel in Mexico was launching rockets at us, what would be the reaction in the United States? And I think in this particular case, on a per capita basis, you know, we're talking about millions of Americans were permanently displaced. That's what it would represent. So I think there needs to be greater awareness so that Hezbollah is clear that the U.S. and all of Israel's allies are supportive, not simply of the elimination of Hamas, but also dealing with the situation in the north.
And what about with Iran itself? You actually commented on the recent Iranian airstrike and what the options are for Israel's response.
So I think one of the biggest lies or misunderstandings in the debate about all of this is that somehow the central issue in the region is the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It is not. The central issue in this region is Iran's ambition to be a regional hegemonic power. They basically now have control of the Iraqi government. We've seen the influence and control they have over Syria. They have Hezbollah is a full-blown agent of Iran right on Israel's border. I think that puts Jordan in threat at some point, and obviously we've seen the role the Houthis have played. So suddenly you see this noose that builds up that they try to put around Israel, at which point what you're seeing in northern Israel, you would see throughout the country making Israel at that point an unlivable place, and it would collapse the state and achieve Iran's ambition for the region. That's really the central threat in this region. Now imagine an Iran with a nuclear capability. Now they become Kim Jong-un. Now they become North Korea with some level of immunity of action because of that nuclear threat that they would possess. So I think it is really important for people to wrap their head around the fact that the central irritant of destabilization, violence, and suffering in this region is not the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
Is that the view in Washington, D.C.?
Well, that's certainly my view and the view of a lot of people that understand this. I'm not sure. I can't speak for the administration and others who probably don't view it the same way or to the same extent. But it's the absolute truth. If Iran did not exist, let me not say Iran, if the Iranian regime were not in power and did not exist, there would be no Hezbollah. There probably would be no Hamas, certainly not with these capabilities. There most certainly would be no Houthi threat. Syria would look very different. Iraq would look very different. Imagine a region without the Iranian regime.
Well, that would be more the mission of the United States than certainly that's not something Israel.
Yeah, no, and I think that one of the problems in the broader West is being naive about your enemies or being naive about your threats. And I think part of the missed opportunity here within Iran is the fact that the Iranian regime is just very unpopular. There are few countries in the world where the population and the leaders are more different than in the case of Iran. We saw just yesterday they sentenced a dissident hip-hop artist or rapper to death. We saw just a couple days ago that they've ramped up efforts. They are literally beating up women in the streets.
So should regime change be a goal, a strategic goal of the United States or the West?
I think it should be, and I think it should be it's certainly a goal of the Iranian people, and we should be supportive of that. We don't spend enough time talking about the fact that the overwhelming majority, especially of young Iranians, do not like this regime, do not like living under this regime, and want to live in a different world and in a different country. And we most certainly, at a minimum, should be echoing those voices and supporting them, not simply accepting this notion that somehow the Iranian regime is representative of the Iranian people. It is not.
Right. I want to go back to Rafah for a minute, because you said you expressed your support for an Israeli operation into Rafah, potentially that could, for example, free hostages and eliminate Hamas. There's been mixed signals. Again, you don't speak for the White House. You have your difference with them on that. And then, of course, on the question of the day after, what comes? Because there's been clear differences between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government. And actually, this is an issue that could end up being decided by a future Republican administration. Yeah. What happens with the Palestinians?
Well, look, on the first point, I'm not a military tactician, but I know what the goal is, and the goal is that Hamas never have the capability to ever do again what it did on the 7th of October. And to do that, you can't allow, I understand, without being a military tactician, that you cannot allow the last remnant of their organization to emerge from this conflict, because they'll claim it as a victory. And it will not just simply empower Hamas, it'll also empower all of Israel's enemies. Israel is a country whose national defense is almost entirely based on deterrence, deterring their enemies. And this is the opposite of deterrence. If Hamas, as currently structured, survives this conflict, it will be the opposite of deterrence. It will encourage other groups to be more adventurous in their attacks on Israel. Now, from a tactical perspective, the Israelis believe that is going in and taking them out in their last stronghold. Now, I don't speak for the Israeli government, obviously, either. Right. I'm not a military tactician. But if that's what they've deduced is necessary for victory, then I think we need to be supportive of it. We're either supportive of victory or we're not. And I would say that when it comes to rules of engagement, one of the important things I point to my colleagues is Israel's engagement in Gaza has put more restrictions in an effort to protect innocent life than the U.S. put on our own troops in Afghanistan or in Iraq. War is a terrible thing, because in war, innocent people die. In this particular case, many innocent people have died because Hamas has deliberately placed them in the way and protected themselves with these human shields. When you're dealing with an enemy that doesn't value human life, we set a terrible precedent when we tell them that they can get away with it. And I think Israel continues to take extraordinary steps to avoid innocent civilian losses in that region, and been very patient with this effort. But eventually they're going to have to go in and do what they need to do to finish this job.
All right. I'm bringing the focus to Washington. The Congress and White House just signed off on an Israel aid bill, but it took a long time to get there, and much longer than previous aid bills to Israel. Both on the Democratic side, you have the so-called leftist progressives who have changed the dialogue about aid to Israel. And within your own party, there are some, even who express support for Israel, have shown a more isolationist bent in terms of what kind of support the U.S. Should give Israel. How concerned should Israel be about what's happening?
So we could have passed Israel aid on October 8th. And we could have passed it in November, and December, and January. In fact, there were multiple efforts to pass it on his own. This is the only pro-American democracy in the entire region. And I don't think there's any question that we could have passed Israel aid on its own. I think what complicated this was the situation. There are differences of opinion on the importance of Ukraine. I personally feel that Ukraine is an important concept, but in the process of leverage in American politics, where if somebody wants something, you need leverage, our southern border problem is very dramatic. Look, we have a problem. We have 9 million, almost 10 million people now have entered the United States from all over the world. We don't know who many of these people are, despite their claims that they do. You've seen the FBI director now repeatedly say that this is the highest risk of a terrorist attack that we've had in a long time. In fact, the other day he basically said he fears that we could have a Moscow-style attack in the United States. You compound that with what we're seeing on American campuses, where you have people in the streets openly.
Well, let me ask you about what's going on American campuses.
Yeah, it's troubling. Yeah, so two things are happening, unfortunately. The first is there's this global left ideology that's taken root in American academia for a long time, and basically holds this: the weaker you are, the more virtuous you are; the stronger you are, the more evil you are, right? And that extends to Hamas. In their view, since Hamas is the weaker of the two, then Hamas must be the victim and supportive, despite the fact that they're rapists and kidnappers and degenerates. And then that plays out into the broader spectrum of the anti-Semitism attached to it, and you see the young students being harassed. I think the story that's not being told is that the American public is watching this. And I do think it's stirring within them a rejection of that message, which is important. Yes, it's annoying to see 300-400 of these freaks, paid for by somebody. Somebody's paying for all this, okay? Because they all have signs that are pre-printed. They all have the same tents. I think it's important to figure out who's paying for all this. They're mobs, and they're taking over college campuses. It's deeply concerning that we have a higher education in our country that has ingrained and instilled these ideas of that Israel's a colonial power. It's the same argument they use against America. There's no doubt it's expressing
against. So is there something that should be done on the governmental level, on your congressional level, to deal with this while still maintaining the right of free speech and
yeah, but there's okay. So free speech is the ability to express your viewpoint on a political issue. Free speech is not free speech can be regulated in terms of time, place, and manner. Free speech does not allow you to take over a college campus. Free speech does not allow you to threaten Jewish students or anyone for that matter. And I would say free speech does not cover someone in the United States on a student visa who's openly in the street supporting a terrorist organization. Those visas should be revoked and they should be removed from our country. So all of these things come into play, but I think at the core of it, these elite institutions, think about this, they have a disproportionate number of our judges, our federal officials, our members of Congress, our presidents, come from these schools. So if this is what's going to be leading our country in 10 years, what do we think U.S.-Israeli politics or U.S. policy in general is going to look like?
So again, is there a concrete action you'd like to see Congress take or the Senate to put?
First of all, I think we have to ask ourselves, why are we pouring billions, and I think billions of taxpayer dollars into institutions of higher education that are not educating? Education is about truth. This is not education. This is indoctrination. You have entire departments in these universities that are indoctrinating people in things that aren't true. It's stunning to me how many of these, again, and I don't know what percentage of the student body they represent, but it's stunning to me how many of these students will tell you that Israel was a country that basically was created because a bunch of European Jewish colonizers imposed themselves on this pre-existing nation state called Palestine, which never existed. They believe that it did. And they believe all these things, and they have fallen for this narrative. But what I remind people of, it's disturbing that it's anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. But their ultimate target is not just Israel, it's America. It's our system of government.
So what should be done again, Senator?
Again, I think the important point is, number one, is we should be calling into question why we are funding these schools, pouring billions of dollars to pay and then forgive the student loans of people that are being indoctrinated by it. I think it's important that these higher education institutions, especially those that are not doing enough to protect the safety of Jewish students on campus, whether their federal funding that they receive should be conditioned and or removed as a result of all of this. Beyond that, I think as a society, we need to ask ourselves, what are young Americans, our future leaders, being indoctrinated with in our higher education system? Because if it's anti-American and destructive to our republic, not to mention our alliances around the world, if it's not truth, but indoctrination and fiction, why are we paying for this?
Now, you spoke about the safety of Jewish students. You represent one of the largest Jewish communities in the United States now, especially there in South Florida, who are also concerned increasingly about general anti-Semitism and safety. I mean, what has to be done, or what do you have to say to those American Jewish communities, the cries that you hear of people saying for the first time in decades they feel somewhat under threat?
What I say is that it's important for all of us, Jews and non-Jews, to speak out against it, to make sure we're doing everything. Now, we cannot just to condemn it, but to ensure that we're providing spaces and that we're providing the environment where Jewish students don't have to hide the fact that they're Jewish and don't feel threatened because of that. We wouldn't tolerate that with any other group. We most certainly shouldn't tolerate it, especially given the history of the ancient poison of anti-Semitism. I'm very proud of the way Florida has handled this. The University of Florida, my alma mater, a school I'm very close to, my former colleague Ben Sass leads it now as the president, has the highest Jewish student population of any school in the country. It has not had incidences like this. In fact, it just announced how it will deal with incidents like this, including 3-year suspensions and bans for any students that participate in anything that they would view as anti-Semitic. So I think that's an example for the country, and I'm glad Florida, we haven't seen it. We've had, groups here and there, but we haven't seen it. It's also important to remember one thing, and I point this, there are a lot of students involved in this, but there are a lot of people that are not students that are involved in these efforts. These are professional agitators, anti-American, anti-Western, global leftists who take advantage of these situations to spread their message. But I think it's been an awakening about what's happening underneath the surface in our country that we need to address. This is not just about Israel. Ultimately, this is about America.
All right, Senator Marco Rubio, again,
thank you.
Thank you for coming to Israel, and thank you for joining us here on I-24 News.
Thanks for having me.